In this video, I'll walk you through a complete raw to final workflow for a night wedding photo. We'll rebuild the colors, control the lighting, and refine the image to create a more romantic mood. First, open the image in Camera Raw. I switch the profile to Portrait. This profile softens skin tones and creates a better base for the adjustments that follow. Since this is a raw file, the colors look quite flat at first. I increase vibrance and saturation slightly to bring more life into the image. Next, I raise tint to shift the color balance toward purple, which helps establish the main color tone of the photo. Then, I increase temperature a little to bring back some warmth and keep the skin tones natural. The overall image still feels a bit dark, so I use curves to lift the brightness of the entire frame. Curves also help smooth out the light distribution. Next, I go into calibration. I move the hue of red primary slightly to the right, so the skin tones shift toward a more natural orange tone. Then, I slightly increase the tint in the shadows, so the darker areas blend better with the purple tone of the image. I also raise the saturation of the green and blue primaries slightly to give the overall color palette more depth. Checking the before and after, with just a few basic tools, the overall color direction is already starting to take shape. To refine things further, I go into masking and select background. However, the ground near the couple is also affected, so I use Subtract with the brush tool and enable Auto Mask to remove the unwanted areas. Now I increase tint and temperature to add more purple tone and warmth to the background. I slightly reduce dehaze to make the background feel softer and more atmospheric. Then I lower exposure a bit so the subjects stand out more from the scene. I add a small amount of clarity to enhance the sparkler details and textures. The background still looks a bit bright, so I reduce exposure slightly again to balance the scene. Next, I create another mask. Select People. All People. Then I choose Intersect Mask with Radial Gradient. This allows the radial gradient to affect only the selected people area without touching the background. Now I increase exposure to brighten the subjects and reduce shadows slightly to add more contrast. Checking the before and after again, when we zoom in we can see quite a bit of noise, which is expected since this is a night shot. If needed, we can use denoise to clean up the image. Reduce the denoise intensity slightly. Camera Raw already does a very good job smoothing out the noise. Next, create a radial gradient around the sparkler area. Increase whites and add a bit of color to make the light in this area stand out more. Turn off reset sliders automatically so the adjustments won't reset when creating a new mask. Then, create another similar mask for the sparkler on the other side so the lighting feels balanced. Since purple is the main color tone of the image, when zooming into the bride's dress we can see a slight purple cast. To correct this, go to color grading and adjust the highlights. Based on color theory, the opposite of purple is green, so add a small amount of green to neutralize the color cast on the dress and keep the fabric looking cleaner and more natural. Checking the before and after, the image now shows a clear improvement in color, lighting, and overall mood. Now click Open to bring the photo into Photoshop and continue refining the final details. First, duplicate the layer using Ctrl-J. The frame feels slightly tilted, so open Camera Raw filter with Ctrl-Shift-A. Go to the Crop tool and use the Straighten option to level the horizon and make the composition feel more stable and easier to read. Next, Ctrl-T is used to slightly reposition the overall framing. Temporarily hiding the background layer helps evaluate the changes more clearly. A rectangular marquee selection is created from the neck downward, then transformed vertically to make the subject appear taller and more elegant. The same adjustment is repeated on the lower body. Working in two separate stretches helps maintain natural proportions and prevents unwanted distortion across the entire figure. After that, select both layers and press Ctrl-E to merge them. Then duplicate the merged layer using Ctrl-J, hide the background layer, and press Ctrl-S to save the PSD file at this stage. Saving early helps keep the workflow safe and makes it easier to return to previous steps if needed. Liquify is then opened using Ctrl-Shift-X. Subtle refinements are made to areas such as the arms, waistline, hair flow, and jaw contour. Liquify requires careful observation and restraint. Over-adjusting can quickly make the image feel unnatural, so very light corrections are preferred to preserve the original body form. Check the before and after using Liquify to make sure the adjustments still feel natural and balanced. Since the subject occupies a relatively small portion of the frame compared to the environment, a soft clone stamp is used to clean minor skin details and background distractions. These small corrections help simplify the visual structure and make the overall image feel cleaner. Teeth can be brightened quickly using a dedicated action with the download link provided in the video description. Checking the before and after throughout the process helps keep the edit controlled and visually consistent. Press Ctrl-Shift-E to merge all visible layers. Saving the file frequently with Ctrl-S is an important habit when working with large layered files. For background areas that look dirty or contain unwanted details, create a selection and use right-click Fill to quickly replace those regions. In addition, several background cleanup actions can be used, with download links provided in the description. Once installed, simply select the area and trigger the assigned shortcut. For zones where the dress meets the background or along subject edges, Clone Stamp can be applied manually to create softer and more natural transitions. Using multiple actions in a thoughtful way helps speed up the workflow while keeping the editing process consistent and efficient. Select a clean brick area, apply a slight feather, duplicate it onto a new layer, and move it to the region that needs fixing. Then merge the related layers. Hold Alt and click on the mask icon to create a black mask. Use a soft white brush to paint back only the necessary areas, allowing for more precise and controlled corrections. Always compare the before and after and press Ctrl+S regularly to save the file. In this area, the skin shows a slight red cast. Create a separate selection, apply a soft feather, use curves to slightly lift the brightness, then use selective color to rebalance the tones for a more even complexion. Next, apply a shadow lifting skin action with the download link available in the video description. Gently paint over darker skin regions to brighten and unify the overall skin tone. After completing these minor refinements, press Ctrl-Shift-E to merge all visible layers. Now the sparkler light is adjusted. Create a selection around the highlight area, duplicate it onto a separate layer, then use Ctrl+T to reposition the layer. Switch to Lighten Blend mode to preserve the bright pixels and help the light integrate more naturally into the scene. If the transition feels harsh, open levels using Ctrl-L and use the black eyedropper to rebalance the darker regions so the light blends more naturally into the background. Then use Ctrl-T to reposition the sparkler cluster. Duplicate the layer and apply Flip Horizontal to create more balanced illumination on both sides. Additional copies can be arranged to increase light density in a controlled and natural way. Add another sparkler layer in front of the subject to enhance the sense of space and visual depth. Apply motion blur to introduce subtle movement in the light. Then add Gaussian blur to soften the transition edges. Reposition the sparkler for a more natural placement, and reopen levels to lift the brightness so the highlight stands out more clearly. Duplicate an additional foreground layer to increase light density and strengthen depth perception. Reduce the opacity slightly so the effect blends more seamlessly into the scene. Finally, group these layers together to keep the file organized and easier to manage. Next, add typography to the image. Select the horizontal type tool, then open the character panel from the menu. Create a new text line and set the color to white. Go to Type, convert to point text, and click OK. This allows more flexible typing and positioning without being constrained by a fixed text box, making it easier to control layout and alignment within the composition. Convert the text to uppercase. Change the font to better match the overall mood, and increase the size to create stronger visual emphasis. Duplicate the text layer and move it downward to create a secondary line. Disable uppercase for this line. Type together and switch to a softer font style to introduce contrast. Reduce the size slightly and adjust the placement to maintain proper visual hierarchy and balance with the main title. Finally, group both text layers together and fine-tune the overall position so the typography integrates naturally into the image. Press Ctrl-Shift-Alt-E to create a new merged layer on top. I usually reopen the camera raw filter to fine-tune the final adjustments. Here, I slightly increase the contrast and reduce the shadows a bit to refine the overall tonal balance and make the image feel more solid. Next, increase the sharpening. Hold the Alt key while dragging the masking slider to better visualize where the sharpening is being applied. Add a subtle amount of grain to give the image a more cinematic feel and reduce the overly clean digital look. Slightly lower the vignette to help guide the viewer's attention toward the subject. Finally, let's take another look at the before and after. The image is now fully refined with clear improvements in light, color, and overall depth. Processing a photo from a raw file to the final result is always a step-by-step process. The key is to control color and detail at a moderate level so the image feels natural and never over-edited. If you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to like the video and leave a comment. It really helps me create more tutorials like this. Thank you very much.